Hello and welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be going over 5 strong builds for Gunner that do not include overclocks. Our very first build is going to be with the leadstorm powered minigun and with the revolver. We will also be going over all of our equipment here too. So the very first build that I have set up for the minigun is pretty straightforward. This is for a general purpose minigun. It works really well against crowds. It works really well against single targets. It should work as a general purpose build for almost everything. The only thing it really struggles against would be things like jellyfish or swarmers, where it's kind of difficult just to hit them. So in tier 1, I'm going with the improved platform stability. This just makes it so our base spread is not as bad, so we can potentially get on target a little bit quicker. The other two tier 1 options are pretty good though too. You could go with an increased rate of fire and get you some more DPS, or go with the cooling. Either one is fine. I like the increased accuracy. In tier 2, we're going with extra damage, so we get 2 more damage, going from 10 to 12. That is a pretty big increase for the minigun itself because you do have such a high rate of fire. This doesn't really hit any breakpoints in particular. It just lets you kill big things a little bit faster. Maybe it does for certain specific enemies, but I'm not aware of it. It's not the more common enemies like grunts. You could go with extra ammunition here though too. Go up to that nice 3,000 ammo. In tier 3, you have 3 really good options, but we're going to go with blow through rounds for this, so we can punch through potentially one enemy and hit another enemy, getting potentially twice as much value, although that's not always the case. But in grunt swarms, it can be pretty useful for clearing them up. In tier 4, we're going to go with lighter barrel assembly, which is a faster spin up. This cuts down on our spin up time dramatically. We go from 0.7 seconds to 0.3 seconds, so we can be shooting even quicker than we did before. And then tier 5, we're going to go with cold as the grave. Cold as the grave lets you cool down the minigun for every kill that you get, so it's really good against grunt swarms, less useful against larger enemies like Praetorians, because you're probably not going to be able to kill more than one of them without the gun just overheating. Heat is kind of a major factor with the minigun, so do pay attention to the overheat mechanic, and if you are really struggling with the overheat, then switching to either aggressive venting or hot bullets is probably better for you. Now for a secondary, we're going to be taking the Bulldog Heavy Revolver. The Bulldog Heavy Revolver is really good just by itself. You can actually one-shot, headshot slashers and regular grunts on Has 5 without any sort of anything on it. It doesn't matter. The revolver can already do that, which is really nice. So that's a major upside to the revolver. It also kills big things really quick. It's very accurate at longer ranges too. Now the way I have it set up is like this. So in tier 1, I have increased reload speed, although you could go with increased accuracy if you'd like. Both of these are pretty good. I like having faster reloads because it just kind of helps when I switch off of my weapon. Generally, if I'm taking the revolver, except for in this case where I'm taking the minigun, I will be running Born Ready, so I can just keep firing the revolver, reloading it, and then wait for my primary to reload and switch back. But this makes for a pretty good quality of life mod. In tier 2, I'm going with extra ammo. This gives us 12 more shots. One of the major problems with the revolver is you don't get very many bullets with it. It hits really hard. It does really well at long range, but having limited shots and missing those shots does really hurt. Having more shots I find to be more useful, so that's why I usually go with more ammo here. In tier 3, I go with hollow point rounds. This gives us 35% more damage when we're hitting weak spots, and the revolver already has a base 25% bonus damage when you're hitting weak spots, so combining these you get 60% more damage whenever you hit a weak spot. In tier 4, I go with extra ammo again. This gives us another 12 rounds, just like in tier 2, or you could switch these around. Go extra damage in tier 2, go with extra ammo in tier 4 if you would like. That can kind of help. That little bit more damage does make a difference, especially against big things, but I like having the more shots. That way I can pick off some of the more valued targets like slashers, tri-jaws, acid spitters, whatever they might be. And if I'm missing shots, it doesn't matter too much because I still have extra ammo overall. And then in tier 5, I'm going with Deadeye. Deadeye makes it so you have no penalty when running around and shooting this. This could be very useful. Lets you just run and gun as you'd like. I like using it for picking off tri-jaws. I find it pretty useful. You could go with the neurotoxin coating though too. In tier 5, neurotoxin coating is a pretty good option as well. Makes it so you can do a little bit more damage over time, and that's pretty fun. Moving on to equipment. First up is our zipline launcher. Zipline launcher is actually super flexible. You can kind of build it however you'd like. So whatever you like the most, just take that. In tier 1, I'm taking increased angle, but the other two options are pretty good too. You don't necessarily always need more ammo, but it's not bad to have. And you also don't necessarily need more reach, but it's also not bad to have. In tier 2, we're going with extra reach because it's our only option, so we don't get a choice there really. And then in tier 3, I'm going with disconnection protection because disconnection protection currently is bugged. At least I think it's still bugged. This one makes it so if you fall off a zipline, you take less damage, which is partially true, but it's not the entire way that this functions. The extra effect that this actually gives you is that you take reduced fall damage from everything until you are downed, so long as you interacted with a zipline. So if you interact with a zipline, hop off it, run around for a while, and then you fall off of something, you will take reduced fall damage from that, weirdly enough, until you go down, and then you'll have to reset this by grabbing another zipline. it's pretty useful, and this works for everybody, not just for Gunner. It works for everybody on the team, so that can be very useful. If you don't like that, though, you can always take the increased motor speed. That way everybody moves a little bit quicker on the zip lines, because the zip lines do move pretty slow. This doesn't help a whole lot, but it does make a little bit of a difference. Moving on to the shield generator, you can also kind of build your shield generator however you'd like. The way that I usually like building it, though, is increased AoE in tier 1, increased duration in tiers 2 and 3. This just makes it so the shield lasts for 9 seconds. That gives you plenty of time to res people or push an objective or just hold an objective for a solid 9 seconds. You can get a lot done within that amount of time, especially if you want to be playing more of a supportive gunner in terms of perks. You could take something like Field Medic and really help res your teammates. We'll talk about perks in just a little bit, but this does help with that. You could go with full AoE shield, go with a really big shield that can completely cover Doretta during escort missions, so nothing can be allowed to attack her unless it's something like the Falling Rocks. They'll still attack when they can, but it will keep all the bugs away so you can repair her. Then for armor, I'm running a usual armor setup to what I basically run on all of my classes. I would recommend you buy everything with the armor suit, though, because if you buy everything, then you will get extra health overall. So it's just going to be a net positive if you buy everything, even if you don't plan on using it. The way I like to run it, though, is larger mineral bag and tier 1. That way we just get to carry more stuff. The other two options in tier 1 are fine, too, if you want to take them. Healthy in tier 2, this just makes it so we can survive extra punishment, which is very useful because on hazards 4 and 5, which these builds are kind of made for, you will be taking substantial amounts of damage if you get swarmed, and having a little bit more health can potentially save your life overall. In tier 3, we have the explosive resistance, super useful with Gunner because this makes it so you might survive a detonator going off right next to you. It will also survive an exploder going off right next to you, at least if you have full health. And then in tier 4, we're going with breathing room. Breathing room is super useful. It makes it so you have 6 seconds of invulnerability once you get rezzed. This is great for getting a resupply or for rezzing other teammates or for pushing an objective. Let's talk about perks now for Gunner. There's quite a few good perks. Let's go over passive perks first. Usually when I'm running is Thorns to keep little things away from me, but this one's not super necessary on Gunner, especially if you like running the Autocannon or the Hurricane. Then smaller enemies aren't as big a deal because you can clear them up pretty easily, so this one is an optional one. Resupplier I find incredibly good and something that I just take on every class because it's such a nice quality of life perk. You get more health back, you get basically born ready, so you get all your weapons reloaded once you take a resupply, and it's just really useful if you've gone down and you're at very critical health. By the time you grab your resupply, it should bring you back up to almost full health. And then the third perk, I usually switch between on Gunner depending on which primary weapon I'm using. If I'm running the minigun, in this case, then I'll take Sweet Tooth. Sweet Tooth gets you more health and it gets you a little bit more move speed, which can be really useful for Gunner, because if you have extra move speed and you're slowed down by your gun, you're moving a little bit faster than you otherwise would. You're still not going to be moving at 100% speed, but that's okay. Just having that little bit extra speed can be pretty useful. If I'm taking the Autocannon or the Hurricane, I'm pretty much always running Born Ready, though. Born Ready makes it so I can put those weapons away once they're done firing and just wait for them to reload themselves, then switch them back out. The Autocannon basically has a 5-second reload anyway. You can reload cancel it to have a slightly quicker reload speed, but it's not that much faster, so Born Ready is pretty nice there. Same thing kind of goes with the Hurricane. Hurricane does have a little bit quicker reload, but it's still rather slow. And I'd rather just have constant fire between my primary and secondary weapons than having to wait in between the reloads. You could go with Elemental Insulation. Makes it so you take less elemental damage. Very useful. You could also go with something like Vampire. Vampire lets you get health back whenever you use a power attack. Can be really useful if you want to run Iron Will with this set too. Now let's go over to active perks. Active perks, I'm usually running Dash as my first active perk. Dash is super useful on Gunner. It makes it so you have a panic button where you can get away from a bad situation, which Gunner otherwise doesn't really have. Like I said, Gunner does not have the most amount of mobility. This gives you mobility, and that is super useful during a fight. It's also really useful in combination with your shield because you can throw down your shield, be pretty safe, be fighting off as many bugs as possible. Once you think the shield is about to end, you can then run, dash out of your shield and get to a safe distance and continue fighting those bugs or robots or whatever you're fighting. And then you should be good to go. If not, you can still kite around a bit, but this will essentially give you 2 saves per every sort of swarm or ambush that you get. It can be very useful. You can also use it in the opposite direction though too. Keep fighting stuff from where your position is, then use dash to get further away. Keep fighting until bugs start really pouring on you, then put down your shield. And then you might even have enough time by the time your shield runs out to use your dash again, because dash only has a 25-second cooldown on it, so comes in handy a lot with Gunner. For a second perk, there's a couple options. I'd recommend either Field Medic or Iron Will. Both of these are really good with Gunner. Iron Will is fantastic, especially with your shield, because it lets you have potentially a res, and you could save the entire team thanks to your shield. Field Medic is another good option here for kind of the same reason. If you're the last person standing, you can potentially quick res somebody, or you can quick res everybody, and if you throw your shield on them, you can quick res them and in relative safety so that they can keep killing or resing other teammates. And those would be kind of the three main perks that I'd recommend for Gunner. If you're playing solo though, those other two aren't as useful, and then you could go with something like Beastmaster. Steve is always useful. He can go and attack and kind of just soak up some damage. So if you get a guard or a slasher, that's pretty good. You could also go with something like Berserker if you just want to do really high damage to enemies. Alright, now that we have all that out of the way, let's move on to our second build with Gunner. This one is going with the Thunderhead Heavy Autocannon as our primary weapon, and we're going to be building this more for direct target damage, but it should work just fine for dealing with crowds. The Autocannon is really good at killing crowds. The way I have this set up is in Tier 1, we're going with extra ammo bags, so we can have even more ammo. The Autocannon is already super ammo efficient, but having even more ammo is even better. It takes forever to run out of shots with the Autocannon this way. In Tier 2, we're going with a faster startup times, so we can increase our base rate of fire faster. This does limit your top rate of fire, but that's okay. This does help at least moving around a little bit and killing things that get too close and medium range, which is primarily where we're going to be using the autocannon. It's not very good at long range. For Tier 3, we're going with extra damage on hit, although any of them in Tier 3 would work really well. If you want extra AoE, you could go with that. If you want increased rate of fire, you could also go with that. Pick whatever you like in Tier 3. Tier 4, we're going with armor breaking. This will just help us knock armor off of bigger enemies like Praetorians. That's pretty nice. If you want more AoE, you could go with that too in Tier 4. Both are great options. And then in Tier 5 for our autocannon, we are going to be going with damage resist when we're at full rate of fire. So we fire the autocannon enough, and then we get 50% damage reduction from all sources. This can also be really useful in non-combat situations. You can use it when you're falling. So if you find yourself falling off of a high height, start firing your autocannon. You'll have 50% damage reduction when you hit the ground, and you might be able to survive some really high falls if you would like to do that. That can be really useful, and it just makes you overall really tanky. Another perk that I forgot to mention with Gunner that actually synergizes really well with this would be Veteran Depositor. So if you want to go full tank Gunner, you can do that. It works really well if you have Molly nearby, especially on low O2 missions where everybody is always clumped around there. Now, to make up for our lack of range, we are going to be going with the coil gun for our secondary weapon. And I don't have this built for ammo because we don't really need ammo. The autocannon has enough ammo to carry us through. We're just going to be using this at long range to pick things off. So in Tier 1, I have faster charge speeds. This lets us have, well, a quicker charge so we can hit enemies a little bit faster. We don't really need extra damage or extra ammo here. Faster reloads in Tier 2. This is just kind of a nice quality of life, but you can pick whatever you'd like in Tier 2. They're all pretty good. Tier 3, we're going with a stun. This lets us stun enemies that we don't kill with the coil gun. Very useful for clearing up menaces and the like. Going with even more tank on Tier 4 so that we have 50% damage reduction when we're charging this. So we can do a similar deal with this as we can the autocannon. And then in Tier 5, we have electricity trail. This will get us a little bit more DPS. It's also pretty decent for clearing up smaller things like swarmers or jellyfish if we need to. We usually don't need to because the autocannon is so good at clearing those things up. This build in particular I found really strong. I've taken this one a couple of times on like deep dives, and it's been generally a cakewalk on most missions. Maybe not on all of them. It can struggle on certain ones, but for the most part, it does really well in most situations. Now, moving on to our third build, we have the Hurricane Guided Rocket System as our primary weapon. And the way I have this set up is for extra ammo in Tier 1, so we can have more ammo overall. You could go with more damage or more AoE if you think you need either of those. The Hurricane is pretty decent on ammo, so you usually don't have to worry about that. I'm going with Armor Breaking in Tier 2. Armor Breaking doesn't work on the explosion of any weapon currently, which makes it not as useful on the Hurricane as it could be, but it's still quite useful because it does still account for the direct impact of the rocket, and that's where a decent amount of your damage is going to be coming from. So, kind of helps there, but you could go with the increased velocity if you want. In Tier 3, we're going with a faster rate of fire. One thing that the Hurricane is kind of lacking is the rate of fire, so going with extra rate of fire in Tier 3 definitely helps it out. It makes it feel much better overall. The slower rate of fire I don't really care for as much, and you don't really need the larger magazine size, especially if you take this with Born Ready. you're usually okay with the 36 rockets that you do have. Going with extra weak spot damage in tier 4, again, we're going to be doing a decent amount of damage from the direct impact of the rocket, but if you want extra AoE damage, you could pick that one too. Both are pretty good. And then in tier 5, we're going with the stun. Stun is very useful overall. You could go with fire, but don't take that on things like Dreadnought missions, because Dreadnoughts can't be lit on fire, so you'll just nerf your damage if you take that. Stun is pretty consistent across every type of mission, and that's usually why I run it, because just stunning things is pretty useful. The Hurricane build like this, I find, is pretty versatile at every range. It might not be the best at close to medium range if there's lots of things coming, but at medium to long range, it's going to do just fine, and you can always steer these directly into the weak spots of enemies, which makes it great for taking out things like spitballers. So for a secondary, we're going to be taking the burst pistol, and I have the burst pistol set up like this, so I have increased accuracy in tier 1. This just makes it so I can hit longer range shots easy. The Hurricane can clear up things quickly at long range, but it does take time for the missiles to get there. This is kind of quicker if I'm just going to spray down a leech or something like that, which makes it kind of useful, and if I want to hit something in the head at close range, I can still benefit from this. If you don't think that that's super necessary, you could go with the extra damage, or you could go with blow-through rounds. Blow-through rounds makes it really good for crowds. In tier 2, you can pick any of these. Usually I'll take the faster reload, but for this particular build, I went with the faster rate of fire. That way we can just spray it out a little bit quicker. This is going to be kind of our panic weapon if things do get a little bit close and we can't shoot them with the Hurricane fast enough. Flip to this and just keep running away as we spray this at enemies. In tier 3, we're going with extra damage, but extra mag size is nice here too. Whatever you would like to take, feel free to take that one. I'm going with extra ammo in tier 4, but weak spot damage or armor breaking is also really useful. It's not as necessary since we're probably going to be using the Hurricane to kill bigger things and just this to spray at stuff. And then we're going with the stun in tier 5, so that way if we hit all 3 shots on an enemy's weak spot, we will stun it, assuming we don't kill it, which the stun can linger for quite a while, and we can just then hammer it with the Hurricane afterwards. Up next is our 4th build, and this is more of a Dreadnought killing build. It's going for more damage, so we have the Minigun as our primary weapon. We are taking, once again, improved platform stability in tier 1, so we can be more accurate. If you want the most amount of damage, go with the rate of fire, though. That will get you the most amount of DPS. In tier 2, we're going with extra damage here. This just lets us hit harder overall. Tier 3, we're going with armor breaking. This can be really good when you're fighting the twins in particular for a Dreadnought mission. On the other Dreadnoughts, it doesn't matter as much. It can also be useful for just clearing up Praetorians or guards. Tier 4, we're going with increased damage once our gun is fully spun up, so we're getting even more damage when we're able to just keep firing at an enemy or multiple enemies. And then we're once again going with Cold as the Grave, although again, if you're running into issues with overheating, try aggressive venting, or try hot bullets. We are once again running the coil gun as a secondary weapon. For tier 1, I'm going with extra ammo, but you could go with extra damage if you just want to hit really hard. That is an option. Extra ammo I find to be a little bit more useful though if I do end up running through shots, because this build in particular can potentially run through ammo a little bit faster than the previous builds that we've talked about. It's still quite ammo efficient, but it's not as ammo efficient as the other ones. In tier 2, I go with Overcharger. This lets you have even more damage the longer you hold that charge up time, but it is a little bit tricky to get used to start out with. In tier 2, we're going with the stun, but the fear could also work. Either one of these is good. Pick whichever one you like. Going with damage reduction in tier 4, I just really like having this for potential fall damage. It's super nice. And then I'm going with the dilated injector system to have a larger radius so we can hit enemies a little bit easier. A lot of the time, I like using this to just punch through walls and hit enemies, probably because of a certain overclock that I use pretty often with this, but it does help with the coil gun because you can ping an enemy and then just fire straight through walls and hit them, assuming the wall is not super deep. And then our 5th and final build is once again using the Autocannon. This time we have it set up for AoE damage and AoE fear, so I'm once again running extra ammo in tier 1. I just really love the extra ammo. You don't need it, but having 200 extra rounds for the autocannon is just super nice. Going with a faster rate of fire in tier 2, so we have a higher top rate of fire, but we have a slower build up to our rate of fire. Going with extra single target damage, but you could go with extra AoE damage or even higher rate of fire in tier 3. Both of these are really fun and really good. Going with an increased AoE radius in tier 4, so we can hit potentially more enemies with our splash damage. And then we're going to go with fear in tier 5, so every time that we do hit an enemy or splash damage to an enemy, there's a chance that he gets feared and just tries to run away. This is really strong for crowd control. It's extremely strong with one particular overclock. For a secondary weapon, we are once again taking the burst pistol, and this time we have it set up for just all damage. In tier 1, we're running extra damage so we can hit a little bit harder. Faster reloads in tier 2, but all of them work really well in tier 2, so pick whichever you'd like. Extra damage in tier 3, so we could once again hit a little bit harder. Extra weak spot damage in tier 4, so if we do get right up next to a big enemy like a Praetorian or an Oppressor, we can just keep spraying it in the weak spot. And then the longer burst fire in tier 5, so we go from shooting 3 bullets each time to shooting 6 bullets each time, so we can have even more damage or potentially more misses. The gun is still quite good at longer ranges. It's not as ammo efficient as our previous build for it, but again, we're using the Autocannon, so we don't really have to worry about that. This I usually use to pick off things like Tri-Jaws or Spitballers at a distance, and then only use it against big enemies at very close range where I can just constantly be running around them and spraying this into them, so Dreadnoughts, Praetorians, Oppressors. I also forgot to talk about grenades. Let's talk about them really quick. I've been using the Tactical Lead Bursters the most out of any of the grenades because I find it the most fun. It might not be the most consistent. It is really good at killing detonators, though, so if you really hate detonators, take the Tactical Lead Burster and save at least 2 to 3 of them whenever a detonator shows up, and just keep tossing these underneath them. 2 or 3 of them will kill them very, very quick. Cluster grenades are very similar to Tactical Lead Bursters in that they can be kind of random as to how useful they are. If you can throw them directly under large enemies, you can clear them up, and they're great for breaking up crowds. Incendiary grenades are probably the most consistent grenade. They're really good for crowd control, but that's about it. They don't do a whole lot to big enemies. They do synergize really well with a couple overclocks that Gunner does have, and if you want to go with full fire Gunner, it is a pretty good option. And we also have our sticky grenades. I kind of did these backwards, but that's okay. Sticky grenades are probably the most straightforward grenade, and they probably do the most consistent damage towards large enemies. They also have a fear on them, so if you hit something directly with them, they will try to run away. It can be really useful for hitting Praetorians. That is basically the main job I use them for. They also have good armor breaking on them, so that's kind of nice. If you want a simple grenade and you really like the plasma grenades from Halo or the Semtex from Call of Duty, this is a pretty good option too. Does it for Gunner. Thanks everybody for watching this. I hope this kind of helped you out. You guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.